Hello, good afternoon. Nurses are likely to take their first ever national strike action, according to their union. The Royal College of Nursing is still counting ballot papers returned by its 300,000 members, but it says those counted so far suggest support for strike action, possibly before Christmas. The RCN wants a 5% pay increase above the rate of inflation. Nurses working in accident and emergency and critical care would be exempted from striking to maintain services. The government says nurses should carefully consider the impact on patients. Here's our health editor, Hugh Pym.
Possible strike action is already looming in parts of the NHS in Scotland. Members of two unions, including ambulance staff at the GMB, have voted for walkouts, though they've called for talks with members.
GMB members have voted to reject that pay offer. So we're currently making plans for over 4,000 GMB members working in all roles across the NHS and the ambulance service to take action, possibly this side of Christmas. So up there, what we are actually doing is urging the Cabinet Minister to come back to the table with a vastly improved offer.
Pay rises lower than inflation over several years and workforce shortages are reasons given by the Royal College of Nursing for the strength of feeling, which led to the ballot of their members. Detailed results of the voting, including turnout, will be formally announced within days. There have been a series of ballots among the RCN's 300,000 members at individual workplaces. The General Secretary, Pat Cullen, says the signs are that across the UK, members have spoken very clearly in favour of strike action. The RCN says any strikes would affect planned NHS treatment and appointments, but not emergency care. In England and Wales, there have been pay awards of £1,400 this year. The Scottish Government has offered just over £2,200. There's been no formal offer yet in Northern Ireland. The Department of Health covering England says recommendations of the independent pay review body have been followed and unions should think hard before taking action which might affect patients. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
The Prime Minister still has confidence in Minister Sir Gavin Williamson despite the leaking of abusive messages he sent to another senior Conservative MP, according to the Cabinet Office Minister Oliver Dowden. He told the BBC's Laura Koonsberg this morning that although Rishi Sunak had been aware a complaint had been made against Sir Gavin, he'd not known the details of the exchange with the former Chief Whip Wendy Morton. Her formal complaint is being investigated. Here's our political correspondent David Wallace-Lockhart.
Sir Gavin Williamson was sacked from the Cabinet by Boris Johnson last year. Rishi Sunak made him a minister again earlier this month, the very same day the Prime Minister promised
integrity, professionalism and accountability.
But we now know that Rishi Sunak was aware that Sir Gavin was the subject of an official complaint made by the former Chief Whip, Wendy Morton. Shortly after the death of the Queen, Gavin Williamson texted Ms Morton to accuse her of rigging the process for allocating spaces at Her Majesty's funeral to punish certain MPs. He called this absolutely disgusting. She replied saying that was not the case. In one of a number of texts Sir Gavin sent featuring expletives, he warned her there is a price for everything. Many more messages were exchanged. This morning, Gavin Williamson's departmental boss said Sir Gavin regretted the messages he'd sent.
That's not acceptable. He shouldn't have said it. He has said that he regrets doing so. He has given some context, which was that this was at the time of heightened frustration. It was, remember him as a backbencher to the Chief Whip.
What, so if you're in a bad mood, it's OK to talk like that to a colleague?
This is not acceptable. However, there is this complaints process ongoing, and it was not the case that the Prime Minister had seen this exchange.
But a former Cabinet colleague of Gavin Williamson suggested the Prime Minister doesn't have time for these kinds of scandals.
The texts he sent to the Chief Whip were unacceptable. And I think Rishi Sunak doesn't have the bandwidth for this kind of negative publicity.
Labour are questioning the Prime Minister's judgment.
What it says is that Rishi Sunak was making decisions simply in his own narrow, short-term interests as far as the Conservative Party leadership was concerned, not the national interest.
Rishi Sunak had already faced criticism for reappointing Suella Braverman as Home Secretary shortly after she sent official documents from her personal email. Today's revelations prompt more questions about the team the Prime Minister has assembled. David Wallace-Lockhart, BBC News.
The Liberal Democrat leader Ed Davey is giving a keynote speech to his party this lunchtime, replacing the one missed when the Lib Dems' annual conference was cancelled after the death of the Queen. The party says homeowners struggling to pay their mortgages because of rising interest rates should be able to apply for a £300 a month grant if their repayments have risen by more than 10% of their income. There will be an extra bank holiday next year across the UK to mark the coronation of King Charles III. It'll fall on the 8th of May, 2 days after the ceremony at Westminster Abbey. It means there will be 3 holiday Mondays next May. The Prime Minister said it would mark a unique moment for the country. At least 3 people are thought to have died after a passenger plane was forced to crash land on Lake Victoria in Tanzania due to bad weather. The plane had taken off from the capital Dar es Salaam. The authorities say they've managed to rescue 26 people so far who have been taken to hospital. Emergency workers used boats to reach the passengers. The United Nations COP27 climate conference got underway this morning in Egypt with the outgoing chairman, Britain's Alok Sharma, telling delegates that inaction will only defer climate catastrophe and asking how many more wake-up calls does the world actually need. The Prime Minister Rishi Sunak flies in today, along with other world leaders, for the 12-day conference. Our environment editor Justin Rolat looks at some of the issues on the agenda.
It has been a year of record-breaking temperatures and climate-related disasters around the world. But Africa has been hit particularly hard. Huge floods displaced more than 1 million people in Nigeria last month. Cyclones ripped through Madagascar earlier this year, while another year of low rainfall pushed parts of Somalia and elsewhere in East Africa even closer to famine. It's easy to see why Egypt says this should be a COP, a climate conference for Africa. Take a look at historic emissions. Developed countries in places like Europe and America got rich burning fossil fuels. Lots of nations in Asia, notably China, are now doing the same. But take a look at Africa's share. It is tiny, less than 8% of the total, and that's the issue. Developing nations say, we didn't cause the climate problem, so why should we pay to fix it? Egypt is saying it's time for the rich world to come good on its promise of $100 billion a year to help finance developing countries to move away from fossil fuels and adapt to the changing climate. And there will be some new demands too. Remember the terrible floods in Pakistan this summer? Well, the developing world is also asking for cash to help with the loss and damage climate-related disasters like this are already causing.
There's a lot of money for war, for instance, in the system always when it's needed. 20 years, there was a war next door. It was costing $300 million a day. So, no, I don't think it's an impossible ask.
Last week, the head of the UN warned of a crisis of trust if there isn't progress on the issue. But with a war in Europe and soaring food and energy prices, wealthy countries warn they already have lots of calls on their cash. They don't want to sign up to an open-ended commitment that could end up costing hundreds of billions of dollars. The US climate envoy John Kerry told the BBC the world's focus should remain on trying to cut emissions to minimise future climate change.
We have an enormous challenge ahead of us to stop the damage from happening. And lots of countries are contributing to that damage today, including in the developing world. So we have to move faster to get off of coal. We have to move faster to reduce fossil fuel consumption.
So there is real potential for conflict and disagreement at the conference. The last COP ended on a high note with ambitious pledges from many nations. This year is about implementing those pledges, and that is a much more ambitious task. In short, don't expect any big breakthroughs in Egypt. Justin Rolat, BBC News.
That's all from us for now. The next news on BBC One is at 5:35. Until then, have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.